Tonight, we're stepping into a story from the Navajo tradition, a tale of danger and courage, and of a world that needed to be made safe. This is the story of the hero twins, born into a land troubled by monsters, where every journey could end in darkness. Who were these twins, and why were they destined to face what even grown warriors feared? What kind of world were they born into, and what did it take to change it? We'll follow them as they grow from vulnerable children into determined travelers, guided by sacred knowledge and hard lessons. We'll meet the beings who test them, the powers they must learn to respect, and the monsters that once hunted the people. It is a story about survival, responsibility, and the long road toward balance. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're winding down for the night or simply looking for a quiet story to carry you into sleep, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. The morning stretched across the land like spilled milk. Dry grass bowed under the touch of the first light, and the juniper trees held still. Changing Woman sat at the crest of a low hill, her legs folded beneath her, her hands resting on her knees. Her eyes scanned the horizon. She waited every morning just like this, watching the east, where the sun made its promise. The earth smelled warm and baked. It always did when prayers hung in the air. She had grown without a husband, not because she was lacking in beauty or strength or cleverness, but because her path bent in another direction. Her parents said little about it. They had seen stranger things born of stranger unions, but she, Changing Woman, had felt something missing, and she believed, with an absolute confidence that required no explanation, that the sun heard her thoughts. It began the day she found an obsidian pebble in the hoofprint of a deer. She picked it up and carried it in her hand all the way home. That night, she wrapped it in corn husk and tucked it near her sleeping mat. In the morning, it was warm. By the second day, hot. By the third day, it had melted through the husk and left a small black circle on the floor. She did not speak of it. Instead, she climbed the same hill each morning before the others woke. She sat facing east. She closed her eyes. She did not whisper, chant, or cry. She simply sat in silence. When noon came, she returned to the brush shelter where she lived with her parents. One afternoon, as the sun balanced high overhead, she saw a figure in the distance. He was not walking. He was riding, and the creature beneath him shimmered between horse and shadow. The man rode straight and slow, without turning his head, as if he knew precisely where she sat. When he reached the foot of the hill, the horse vanished into dust. The man climbed the slope. He was wrapped in white cloth that glinted faintly, like polished shell. His face looked like sunlight through smoke. He stopped an arm's length from her and said only one thing. "Build a brush shelter," he said. "Lay yellow pollen on the floor and white cornmeal near the opening. Sit there through the night. I will come to you." Then he walked back down the hill. He did not ride away. He simply vanished, and the grass where he had stood was pressed flat and steaming. Changing Woman returned home and said nothing. That evening, she walked beyond the family camp and built a shelter of cedar branches and dry grass. She lined it with soft cloth and sprinkled yellow pollen in a spiral pattern on the ground. She placed white cornmeal at the entrance and sat down inside. The wind sighed but never entered. The air grew cooler. Owls called. Coyotes yipped. Then the night passed, and nothing came. The second night she sat again. This time she heard breathing. It was not her own. It came from the corner of the shelter. She reached out and found only cedar sticks and shadow. In the morning, the cornmeal was disturbed. The pollen pattern was smudged. Her heart pounded, but she stayed. The third night, the breathing grew louder. She felt warm air near her cheek, like someone leaning close but just out of sight. She whispered a question, but no voice answered. In the morning, she found a single strand of sun-golden hair curled around the pollen spiral. She placed it inside a deerskin pouch and said nothing to her parents. The fourth night, the man came. She felt the heat of his skin before she saw him. When she opened her eyes, he stood at the doorway, too bright to look at. He crouched beside her and said nothing. He did not touch her. He placed his hand on the ground and pressed his palm flat into the pollen. Then he turned and walked away. In the morning, the handprint still glowed faintly. When she stood up, her stomach turned, and her legs felt soft. She understood. The man had given her something. She did not know his name. She went home, and her father saw her strange expression. "What happened?" he asked. She touched her belly and said, "A man came to me, and we will meet again." Her father said nothing. Her mother nodded, and they began to build another shelter. This one was made with more care. They brought sacred plants. They lined the floor with woven mats. Her father placed the pollen spiral himself and sat with her through the night. In the morning, the pollen was disturbed. On the second night, the cornmeal was wet. On the third night, a streak of blood appeared across the doorway. On the fourth night, the wind howled so loudly they could barely hear each other breathe. Then, on the fifth morning, the sky broke open. Changing woman bent double in the shelter. Her hands dug into the earth. Her cries pierced the morning like arrows. Her father panicked, and her mother stood still as a tree. But before they could act, two strangers arrived. One wore white and blue. The other wore red and black. They moved like smoke but spoke clearly. One said, "I am talking God." The other said, "I am water sprinkler." They did not wait for permission. Talking God knelt and tied a rope of sunbeams. Water sprinkler pulled a cord made from rainbow. They handed the ropes to Changing Woman and said, "When the pain grips you, pull with both hands." She did. The pain came like lightning and left her blind. Her fingers curled around the ropes. Her teeth bit through her own lip. Then there was a sound like tearing cloth, and a child emerged. Talking God caught the baby, washed him in warm water, and cut the cord with a white shell knife. The child screamed once, and then blinked. Water Sprinkler said, "Another comes." Changing Woman groaned and pulled again. Her arms trembled. The second baby slid free, and Water Sprinkler caught him. He bathed him in a shallow bowl and cut the cord with a knife made of turquoise. This child did not cry. He stared upward. Talking God raised the first boy and said, "He will be called Monster Slayer." Water Sprinkler lifted the second and said, "He will be called Born for Water." The two babies lay beside each other on a blanket of rabbit fur. Their skin glowed faintly. Their fingers clenched and unclenched. Changing Woman leaned back against the wall of the shelter, her face streaked with blood and tears. The holy people nodded and stepped away. They left no footprints in the dust. The sun rose higher. The babies slept. Changing Woman's father brought warm broth in a clay bowl and said nothing. Her mother combed her hair and hummed a prayer without words. Outside, the world continued its steady spinning. The babies grew in the way that such children do. They did not cry often. They laughed at odd hours and studied the world with eyes too focused for their age. By the time they could walk, they ran. By the time they could speak, they spoke in complete thoughts. People in the village whispered. Some said they were spirits reborn. Others said they were cursed. A few avoided them, but most watched with fascination as they raced across the fields, barefoot, hair tangled, legs scratched by cactus and brush, grinning at each other as if they understood something no one else did. One morning, before the sun reached its peak, two men appeared on the ridge. They were strangers, but they did not ask for directions. They walked straight to the place where the twins played and said, "We are looking for two boys who run like deer and climb like hawks." The twins stood up. The first man introduced himself. "I am Talking God," he said, though he wore no markings now. "This is Water Sprinkler." Water Sprinkler waved. "We have come to race you," said Talking God. "We want to see what your legs can do." The twins said nothing. They nodded. They lined up at the base of the ridge. Talking God raised a staff of willow and struck the ground. "To the top of the mesa and back," he said. They ran. The wind slapped their faces. Stones flew behind them. The older men took the lead at first. Their legs were longer, their lungs were trained, but the boys did not tire. When they reached the top of the mesa, the men looked back and saw the twins only a few steps behind. On the way down, the children passed them. Talking God shouted, laughing. Water Sprinkler howled. At the finish, the twins landed first, panting but grinning. "You will need faster legs than that," said Talking God, and he whipped them gently with a switch of dried bark. "Again," said Born for Water, and so they ran 4 times. Each time the men gave them harder trails, steeper climbs, longer paths. Each time the boys ran faster. On the 4th race, they did not stop to breathe at the top. They shot down the hill like arrows and hit the bottom without stumbling. Talking God looked at Water Sprinkler. "They are ready," he said. "Tell their mother." At the evening fire, the boys turned to Changing Woman. Monster Slayer asked her directly, "Who is our father?" Changing Woman stirred the corn mush and looked into the flames. She did not speak at first. Then she said, "Your father is a round cactus." The boys exchanged glances. They did not understand. They waited. Changing Woman said nothing more. That night she sat by herself and stared at the stars. She held her hand over her belly and whispered a name that no one else knew. The next day, trouble stirred. The birds were loud. The dogs refused to eat. The wind blew from the wrong direction. In the west, a column of dust rose like a warning. At noon, a raven appeared and perched on a post. It cawed once and flew away. Monster Slayer aimed an arrow and loosed it. The bird vanished. Changing Woman appeared beside him and said, "That bird spies for the bird monster. Do not follow it." The next day, a vulture circled overhead. Born for Water flung a stone at it. The bird shrieked and vanished. "That one belongs to the cliff monster," Changing Woman said. "Do not chase him." On the 3rd day, a magpie landed on the roof of the shelter. It sang 3 strange notes. The boys stepped outside with bows raised. The magpie tilted its head and flew east. "That one reports to the one who kills with his eyes," said Changing Woman. "Now they know you are here. They will come." The wind rose. The sky darkened. Changing Woman built 4 hoops from old bone. She threw them to the 4 corners. They sank into the earth and glowed. A wall of wind rose around the shelter. She said, "They will not pass before morning." The boys looked at each other. "We leave before dawn," said Monster Slayer. "Yes," said Born for Water. "We go east." And as the stars blinked above them, the twins prepared to leave everything they knew behind. The night before they left, the house felt too small. The twins lay side by side on their mats and stared at the ceiling. Smoke stains traced faint lines across the wooden beams. Somewhere outside, a dog scratched at its own fleas. Someone coughed. A pot shifted on the coals with a dull scrape. Their village followed its simple rhythm, and no one slept deeply. Monster Slayer turned his head toward his brother. In the half-dark, he saw the outline of Born for Water's profile, eyes open and unblinking. "You are awake," Monster Slayer said. "Yes," Born for Water answered. "You are awake too." They did not whisper. Their voices stayed low and flat, like stones laid on the earth. "Mother knows they are coming," Monster Slayer said. "She saw the monsters on the hill," Born for Water replied. "She set the wind wall. It will hold until morning." Monster Slayer clenched his hand into a fist and then relaxed it. "They come for us." Born for Water nodded once. "We leave before the sun rises. If we stay, the monsters will tear this place apart to reach us. They will eat every person who shelters us. They will crush the Hogans and drink the blood from the ground." There was no tremor in his voice when he said it. He spoke like someone listing the steps of a known chore. Monster Slayer breathed once, slow and deep, and stared up again. In the next room, Changing Woman sat upright. Her back was straight and her hands rested in her lap. Her parents slept nearby, turned toward the wall. They had lived long lives. Their breath moved in and out in even strokes. Changing Woman studied them. She knew how their faces would change if they woke to the sound of breaking wood and dragging claws. She rose without a word, gathered her blanket, and went to sit by the doorway. Outside, the wind barrier roared. It did not whisper or murmur. It slammed against the invisible hoops she had thrown to the 4 corners. Dust and grit spun in thick spirals. The sky had no stars. Clouds pressed down and hid them. Changing Woman could not see the hills. She could only feel their presence in the shape of the land under her feet. She knelt and placed her palm on the ground. The soil felt hard and dry. Small pebbles pressed into her skin. She sat like that for a long time, as if she were listening through her hand. No one spoke. The night moved in heavy steps toward morning. The twins rose before the first pale line of light touched the horizon. They did not roll up their mats. They did not gather possessions or food bundles. They knew speed mattered more than comfort. They stepped carefully around their sleeping grandparents and came to the doorway. Changing Woman looked at them without surprise. She had expected this exactly. "You have decided," she said. Monster Slayer nodded. "We go east." Born for Water added, "We will find the one who made us. If he wishes to admit it, he will answer, or we will make our own answers." Changing Woman studied their faces. She saw the same curve in their noses that she had seen once in the shape of a shadow near her door. She saw the same hard light in their eyes that sometimes shone from the disk above the world. She did not argue. "You will go on the path where the dawn rises," she said. "Keep the sun at your left in the morning, and your right when it returns to the west. Eat what the land offers if it does not bite you first. Trust the signs. Trust the ones who helped you be born. They have plans, even if they enjoy hiding them." She reached out and gripped each boy by the shoulder. Her hands were firm. "When you walk, walk together. When you run, run for each other." Monster Slayer and Born for Water bowed their heads in agreement. They did not embrace her. They took her words as their goodbye. Then they stepped through the doorway and into the storm. The wind struck them like a wall of fists. Dust stung their eyes. Their hair whipped across their faces. The barrier that had held the monsters outside now pressed against them as well. With each step they felt resistance. The air seemed thick and full of angry hands. They leaned into it. Monster Slayer shouted something, but the wind swallowed it. Born for Water grabbed his brother's arm so they would not lose each other in the spinning grit. They took 3 steps forward and moved only half a body length. They took 10 more steps. Slowly, stubbornly, they broke through. On the far side of the barrier, the wind dropped at once. Behind them, the storm continued to whirl around the village, a ring of dust that turned on itself. Ahead of them, the land lay quiet. The grass bent gently. The horizon opened. They did not look back. They walked east. Their bare feet pressed the sandy soil. After some distance, they left the farms and fields behind. The land lifted into rolling hills and shallow ravines. Sage and rabbit brush dotted the ground. Here and there stood a twisted juniper, its trunk split and scarred by old storms. The first thin band of light appeared in the east. The twins walked toward it without hesitation. By the time the sun heaved itself up, they had already covered a long stretch. The air warmed. Their breaths settled into an easy rhythm. Their bodies knew how to move. Each stride seemed to have lived in their muscles since birth. Around midday, Monster Slayer said, "Do you think he will deny us?" "Who?" said Born for Water, though he knew. "The one mother named as Cactus," Monster Slayer answered. "The one who is more than cactus. The one who sent the bright rider. The one who pressed his hand into pollen. The one whose face burns your eyes if you stare too long." Born for Water walked in silence for a few steps. Then he said, "If he tries to deny us, we will show him our faces and see if he recognizes his own work." Monster Slayer laughed. The sound bounced off a rock outcrop and startled a lizard, which darted into a crack. They stopped at a small spring to drink. The water bubbled up through a bed of stones and ran in a thin trickle down a shallow channel. The boys knelt, cupped their hands, and drank until their bellies felt full. The water tasted cold and clean, with a hint of iron. Monster Slayer splashed some on his face. Born for Water washed his feet and the backs of his hands. "Do you think she will live through the night?" Monster Slayer asked quietly, with all of them gathering around her. Born for Water scooped another handful of water and let it pour back into the stream. "She called the wind herself," he said. "The monsters will rage all night and tear at the air. They may rip away trees and smash rocks, but they will go nowhere. The wind will hold them. When the sun rises and sees us away from the village, he will watch over what is his." There was no comfort in his tone. He described the shape of events as he saw them. Monster Slayer nodded once. They rose from the spring and moved on. As they walked, memories of the races with Talking God and Water Sprinkler circled through their minds. They remembered the first race, when their chests had burned and their sides had cramped. They had gritted their teeth and kept going. They remembered how Talking God had laughed and still whipped them with the willow switch when they reached the end. "You run like foals," he had said. "Fast for a while, then clumsy. Learn to run like wolves." They begin slow and finish strong. The second race had been longer. The men had taken them along a narrow deer path that wound around the northern slope. Loose stones rolled under their feet. The twins fell once, picked themselves up, and kept going. By the last stretch, their mouths tasted of blood and dust, but their strides lengthened. That day, the men had frowned less when they whipped them. By the fourth race, the boys had flown down the hill. Their legs moved like parts of a well-made bow, their lungs filled and emptied with no complaint. They had reached the finish, breathing hard but still ready to sprint again if told. Talking God had thrown away the willow switch that day. "You will need this strength for the things that come," he had said. On the eastern trail now, that strength carried them. By late afternoon, they reached a low rise. From the top, they could see far in every direction. The village behind them lay hidden behind distance and bends in the land. Ahead, a faint smudge marked the line of distant mountains. They knew that somewhere among those peaks lived beings even older and more troublesome than Talking God and Water Sprinkler. Monster Slayer planted the heel of his foot into the soil and twisted it. "If the monsters come across our tracks," he said, "they will sniff their way east and follow us." Born for Water shook his head. "They are staring at the wind wall and grinding their teeth. They do not think we left. They will spit and roar and complain. They will pound on the barrier until their hands bleed. They will spend their fury on empty air. By morning they will be tired and confused." Monster Slayer grunted. "Good. Let them waste their strength on air." They sat for a short while and ate dried corn from a small pouch the Changing Woman had pressed into their hands without a word. Each kernel cracked between their teeth. It tasted of fire and smoke and long evenings in front of the hearth. As the twins chewed, another scene played out far behind them. At the edge of the wind wall, a creature shaped like a man with legs too long and arms too thick slammed his fists into the barrier. He was covered in scales and patches of hair. His jaw jutted forward and his teeth stuck out like broken tools. Each time he struck the whirling wall of air, dust flew up and stones rattled. His blows landed on nothing visible, yet each strike met a hard surface. "Move aside," he shouted to no one. "Open, or I will crush you." The wind roared in his face and pushed his words back into his mouth. He choked on dust and spat a spray of mud. Behind him stood others. A creature with a horned head, a hunched thing with glowing pits for eyes, a tall woman with claws instead of fingers and a long tongue that hung from her mouth. They pressed closer to the ring of dust and squinted at the village beyond. In the center of the village, Changing Woman sat by her doorway, straight-backed and still. The wind did not touch her. The air around her remained clear. Her hair lay flat on her shoulders. She did not look at the shapes that moved beyond the barrier. She kept her eyes on the fire in front of her. Her parents had woken when the first blows landed on the invisible wall. They had risen in alarm, but she had told them to sit. She had said only, "They cannot reach us before dawn. Stay away from the sound." The old man and old woman sat with their backs against the interior wall of the house. The noise outside made the wooden poles tremble. Dust fell from the ceiling. A clay pot cracked along one side. The old woman reached out and steadied it. Her fingers shook. "What do they want?" the old man asked. "The boys," Changing Woman said. "And if they do not find them," the old man asked again, "they will look for someone to tear apart instead," Changing Woman answered. Her mother swallowed and glanced at the doorway. "Are they gone?" she said, though she already guessed. "They left before the light," Changing Woman replied. "They walked toward the east. They did not look back." The old woman covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders moved once. She lowered her hands again and set her jaw. "They have your stubbornness," she muttered. All night, the monsters clawed at the air. Their nails left no mark. Their curses circled back and filled their own ears. They tried fire. The flames blew sideways and died. They tried stones. The rocks bounced away and rolled back toward their own feet. They tried teeth. Their jaws closed on nothing. Each failure made them angrier. Inside the barrier, the people stayed awake. Children pressed their faces into their mothers' shoulders. Men sat with spears in their hands that never left their laps. Dogs whined under the beds. Goats huddled together and stamped nervously. Every living creature in the village understood that something enormous and hungry waited just beyond reach. Sometime after midnight, the monsters grew tired. The long-legged man sank to his knees. The horned thing leaned on its own curved weapon. The woman with the claws licked blood from her split fingertips and scowled. They had expected an easy feast. Instead, they met resistance from empty air. Their pride suffered more than their bodies. Finally, as the sky in the east began to pale, they stepped back. Their anger did not vanish. It changed direction. They began to argue with each other. Long-legged accused Grinning Eyes of lying about the boys hiding here. Horned Monster blamed Bird Monster for giving bad information. Bird Monster spread his wings and hissed. Their voices rose in snarls and shrieks. They did not notice the precise moment when the wind wall began to fade. The hoops that Changing Woman had thrown to the corners sank deeper into the earth and lost their light. The air settled. The dust dropped. By the time the barrier vanished entirely, the monsters were already walking away, still arguing, still hungry, already planning their next move. Back on the trail, the twins felt the change without seeing it. A brief shiver ran through the ground. A bird that had flown in a crooked pattern suddenly flew straight. Monster Slayer glanced up. "The barrier is gone," he said. Born for Water felt the hair on his arms rise. "Then they know we are not there," he said. "They will follow our scent. They will taste our footprints. We must move faster." They rose and began to run. Their run stretched into a long, steady effort. Their arms pumped. Their feet landed and lifted again with a rhythmic slap. Their breath fell into a pattern they knew from their races. There was no hurry in the sense of wild panic. There was urgency, but also a strange calm. They had trained for this without knowing they had trained. The land changed under their feet. The soft sand gave way to patches of rock. The rocks grew larger and more broken. Each step required attention. They leaped over narrow cracks. They slid down loose gravel. They climbed small ridges and dropped into shallow washes. The sun climbed higher and pressed heat onto their heads. Sweat ran down their faces and dried into pale streaks. At one point, they reached a flat stretch covered in gravel and scattered stones. A rabbit shot out from behind a rock and darted across their path. Monster Slayer snatched an arrow from his quiver and shot without stopping. The arrow struck the ground where the rabbit's tail had been a moment before. The animal veered sharply and vanished into a crevice. "You missed," Born for Water said. and there was a brief spark of humor in his voice. "The rabbit owes me thanks," Monster Slayer replied. "It will live to complain about me another day." They both laughed. The sound loosened something in their chests and made the run feel shorter. By late afternoon, their shadows stretched out behind them like thin black spears. Their legs ached in a pleasant way. At the edge of a small ravine, they stopped and looked across. On the far side, high on the ridge, a figure sat on a stone outcrop. At first they thought it was a person. Then they saw the glint of feathers and the narrow shine of eyes that were too bright. The figure tilted its head. A raven, or perhaps something that used a raven's body as a convenient shape. Monster Slayer raised his bow. Born for Water placed a hand on his arm. "Mother told us," he said. "The raven served the one who eats people from the sky. We have already sent one arrow at that shape. It left without dying. If we hit this one, we may only encourage the message." Monster Slayer lowered the bow. "Then we let it watch," he said. "Let it see we are not afraid." They stared at the bird. The bird stared back. After a time, it let out a harsh call and lifted into the air. Its wings beat strongly. It flew toward the distant mountains. "Good," Born for Water said. "Carry the news as far as you like. By the time your master hears, we will be gone from this place and closer to the one we want." The sun edged downward. The sky softened from blue to the color of old bruises. The twins found a sheltered hollow between two boulders and settled there for the night. They gathered dry brush and lit a small fire. Flames licked around the sticks and sent a narrow thread of smoke upward. They had no blankets. They sat close to the blaze and shared what little food remained. Their stomachs still grumbled, but they ignored it. Hunger felt trivial compared with the large intention that pushed them east. Monster Slayer poked the fire with a stick. "When we meet him," he said, "what will be the first thing you say?" Born for Water considered. "I will say, we walked here on our own legs. We crossed the land that you shine on. We grew in the body of changing woman. We came to ask why you left her to explain our birth with a cactus." Monster Slayer grinned. "That should open the conversation." "And you?" Born for Water asked. "What will you say?" Monster Slayer stared into the flames. "I will say, we hear of monsters. We see what they do. We want tools to cut their heads from their shoulders. If you prefer those monsters, you can keep them. If you prefer us, help us." Born for Water nodded once. "Simple," he said. "He will answer, or he will dodge. Either way, we will learn something." The stars came out one by one, clear and sharp above them. The twins rolled onto their sides and rested their heads on their arms. The stones under them were hard. The fire crackled and cooled. Sleep came in short stretches. Each sound of a distant cry woke them for a moment. Each time, they listened, heard nothing near, and let their eyes close again. Far away, the monsters gathered for a council. Nearer but still unseen, other eyes watched the boys as they slept. Nothing approached them that night. Their path east remained open. Morning would bring them closer to the first of the true guardians of the road to their father. The twins woke before dawn because their bodies had learned the habit of leaving early. Monster Slayer sat up first and rubbed grit from his eyes. Born for Water sat up a moment later and stared east, as if he could see through the dark. The fire had collapsed into a low bed of ash. Monster Slayer pushed a few sticks together and blew softly until a small flame appeared. He warmed his hands for a breath, then stood and stamped his feet against the cold rock. They ate the last of the corn they carried. The kernels scraped across their tongues and stuck between their teeth. When they finished, Monster Slayer tipped the pouch upside down and shook it. A single grain fell into his palm. He flicked it into his mouth and chewed it slowly, as if he were making a point. "We hunt today," he said. Born for Water nodded. "We hunt when we see something worth shooting." They started east again. The land rose in broken steps. Low mesas cut the horizon. The ground became rockier, and the plants grew tougher. They passed clumps of cactus with spines like needles and small flowers that looked too delicate for the harsh soil. They crossed a dry wash where old flood lines marked the stone. Their feet landed carefully, then faster, then carefully again. The day moved from cold to warm. The sun climbed higher. Their shadows shortened. Near midday, they saw a movement in the sky. A black shape turned in wide circles. Monster Slayer stopped and shaded his eyes with his hand. Born for Water watched without moving. "It follows us," Monster Slayer said. "It watches," Born for Water replied. "A watcher leaves and returns. A hunter closes distance." Monster Slayer spat a bit of dry corn husk from his teeth. "If it is a messenger, it will talk with its wings. If it is hungry, it will talk with its beak." They kept walking. The bird stayed far above them, circling, gliding, circling again. It did not dive. It did not cry out. It simply remained there, a small dark mark against the blue. By afternoon, the land changed again. The rock under their feet grew smoother and darker. The ground sloped upward toward a mountain. Its sides were cut by ravines and scattered with boulders. On the lower slopes, pine trees appeared, their trunks straight and their needles tight. Higher up, the trees thickened. The air smelled of sap and damp stone. Monster Slayer pointed. "That mountain looks older than the rest." Born for Water looked along the ridgeline. "That mountain looks like a place where people hide things." They climbed. Their breathing deepened. Sweat ran down their backs and soaked the waist of their clothes. They stopped once to drink from a shallow pool caught in a stone basin. The water tasted like minerals and leaves. Monster Slayer drank first. Born for Water drank second. Then they wiped their mouths with the backs of their hands and kept climbing. Halfway up, they found a crack in the rock face, a narrow opening like a mouth. Smoke drifted from it in a thin thread. Monster Slayer crouched and touched the stone near the opening. It felt warm. Born for Water leaned close and sniffed. "Someone cooks inside," he said. "Someone lives," Monster Slayer said. They crouched at the opening and listened. They heard a faint crackle. They heard a sound like a stick dragged across hard ground. Then they heard a voice, old and dry, speaking as if it had been waiting for them to arrive. "You can come in," the voice said. "You can stand there all day, and your legs will grow tired. I will still be inside." Monster Slayer glanced at his brother. Born for Water nodded once. They stepped into the crack and squeezed through. The passage widened quickly. The stone opened into a chamber, large enough for a small house. A fire burned in the center, contained by a ring of stones. The smoke rose and escaped through a hole in the ceiling. Along the walls lay bundles of herbs, dried corn, woven mats, and clay bowls stacked neatly. An old woman sat beside the fire. Her hair hung in long gray strands. Her face was creased and lined. Her eyes were sharp. She watched the twins with calm attention, as if she had been counting their footsteps from far away. Monster Slayer stood straight. "Who are you?" he asked. The old woman smiled, and her teeth were small and even. "People call me Spider Woman," she said. They call me that because I spin things. I spin string. I spin plans. I spin a way out when someone walks into a trap. Born for Water looked at the bundles on the wall, then at her hands. Her fingers were thin and strong. He saw bits of thread wrapped around one wrist. We did not come to steal, Born for Water said. Spider-Woman waved a hand as if brushing away a fly. Your faces say you carry questions. Your feet say you carry urgency. Sit down. The twins sat on the ground near the fire. The warmth reached their legs first. Monster Slayer felt his muscles loosen. Born for Water folded his hands in his lap and watched the old woman's face, waiting. Spider-Woman reached into a clay pot and pulled out 2 corn cakes. She placed one in each boy's hands. The cakes were warm and rough. They smelled of roasted corn and smoke. Eat, she said. A hungry mouth speaks too quickly. Monster Slayer took a bite. The cake was dry, but it filled his mouth and gave him something to do with his teeth. Born for Water ate more slowly, taking small bites and chewing carefully. Spider-Woman watched them eat, then leaned forward slightly. You left your home, she said. You ran east. You ran with purpose. You ran because something with teeth found your scent. Monster Slayer swallowed. Monsters gathered around our village, he said. They came for us. Spider-Woman nodded. They came for you because your birth carries heat. It carries attention. Some creatures like attention because it leads them to prey. Born for Water lifted his chin. We will kill them, he said. We will kill every monster that hunts people. Spider-Woman laughed once, short and surprised. Then she looked at them as if measuring. You speak with confidence, she said. Confidence helps when you pull a bowstring. Confidence also helps a young man walk into danger without shaking. It will help you. It will also attract more trouble. Monster Slayer leaned forward. Mother told us our father was a round cactus, he said. We asked for his name. She gave us that answer and stopped talking. We know she hides the truth to keep it safe. We came east to find the truth. Spider-Woman stared into the fire for a moment, then reached for a stick and pushed a burning piece of wood to one side. Sparks rose. She watched the sparks drift upward and disappear. Your mother is changing woman, she said. She carries many lives in one body. She carries seasons in her hands. She gave you birth because something bright chose her. Your father is the Sunday. The words landed plainly. Monster Slayer blinked once. Born for Water's eyes narrowed, as if he were focusing. The sun, Monster Slayer repeated. Spider-Woman nodded. Yohonai. He rides across the sky every day. He burns skin. He warms stones. He ripens corn. He sees everything that stands in the open. Born for Water kept his voice steady. We will go to him, he said. You will try, Spider-Woman replied. Many try. Few arrive. Those who arrive come with help. Monster Slayer took another bite of corn cake and chewed. Tell us the path. Spider-Woman leaned back against the wall and folded her hands. You will cross 4 places, she said. Each one kills people in a different way. The first crushes, the second cuts, the third pierces, the fourth burns. Born for Water's gaze stayed fixed on her. Describe them, he said. Spider-Woman lifted one finger. The first is a narrow pass between 2 cliffs. The cliffs slide together and grind anything that stands between them. They open. They close. They do not care who you are. She lifted a second finger. The second is a field of reeds. The reeds swing like clubs. They slice skin and break bones. They move fast, and they do not stop. A third finger rose. The third is a stretch of cane cactus. The spines pierce feet, legs, hands, face. A man who falls there bleeds until he sleeps and does not wake. She lifted a fourth finger. The last is a wide bed of sand that boils with heat. It burns souls. It burns lungs. It burns eyes. People sink and their bodies harden where they fall. Monster Slayer stared at the fire. "So we die," he said simply. Spider-Woman shook her head. "You walk through," she said. "You walk through because I help you." Born for Water nodded once, as if he had expected that part. "What do you give us?" he asked. Spider-Woman stood. Her knees cracked softly when she rose. She walked to the far wall and lifted a bundle from a peg. When she returned, she carried a tight roll of feathers and thread. She sat again and began to unwrap it. Her fingers moved quickly, deftly. Inside the bundle lay thick feathers, long and dark. Some were brown, some were white. Some carried a sheen like oil. She selected several and held them up to the light from the fire. "These come from great birds," she said. "Birds that ride high winds. Birds that land on cliffs and look down on everything. Their feathers know how to move through danger because they move through storms." She began to weave. She threaded the feathers into a hoop, binding them with a cord that looked like sinew. Her hands pulled the cord tight. She tied knots with a practiced motion. The hoop took shape quickly. It was large enough to hold with 2 hands. It smelled faintly of smoke and dry grass. When she finished, she held it out toward Monster Slayer. "Take it," she said. Monster Slayer took the hoop. The feathers pressed against his palms. The hoop felt light. It also felt strong, as if it would hold its shape under pressure. Spider-Woman turned to Born for Water and handed him a small pouch. It was made of soft hide. It was tied with a thin cord. "Open it," she said. Born for Water opened the pouch and looked inside. Yellow pollen lay in a neat mound. It smelled sweet, like flowers crushed between fingers. "Pollen," he said. Spider-Woman nodded. "You will use it. You will place it on your hands. You will place it on your forehead. You will place it on your tongue. You will take the hoop and stretch it out in front of you. Then you will sing." Monster Slayer looked up. "Sing what?" he asked. Spider-Woman's eyes stayed on him. "You will sing the words I teach you. You will speak them clearly. You will speak them as instructions to your own body. Your breath will follow the words." Born for Water's mouth tightened. "Teach us," he said. Spider-Woman leaned forward and began to speak. Her voice took on a steady rhythm. She spoke a short line. The twins repeated it. She spoke another line. The twins repeated it again. The words were in Navajo, plain and direct, full of movement and instruction. The words described stepping forward, lifting feet, placing hands, keeping balance. They described the road ahead and the need to pass through. They repeated each line until Spider-Woman nodded. Then she added another. Monster Slayer's voice grew louder as he learned the cadence. Born for Water's voice stayed calm and even. They did not argue about pronunciation. They worked like 2 men, sharpening knives side by side, focused on getting the edge right. When the lesson ended, Spider-Woman watched them for a moment. Then she reached to the side and lifted 2 more objects. One was a small stone knife with a smooth handle. The other was a bundle of thin cords tied together. She gave the knife to Monster Slayer. "This cuts cord and hides," she said. "It cuts bindings, it cuts vines, it cuts trouble when it comes close." She gave the bundle of cords to Born for Water. "These tie," she said. "They bind what needs binding. They pull what needs pulling. They hold what tries to slip away." Born for Water tested the cords between his fingers. "You give practical things," he said. Spider-Woman smiled again. "Practical keeps people alive," she said. "Stories keep them honest. You can use both." Monster Slayer shifted the hoop on his lap. "What do you want in return?" he asked. Spider-Woman looked at him as if he had asked why rocks fall downhill. "I want you to live," she said. "I want you to reach your father. I want you to take weapons from him. I want you to kill the monsters who hunt people. I want the roads safer for children. I want fewer bones in dry washes." Born for Water said, "We will do it." Spider-Woman nodded. "You will also meet things that talk," she said. "Some will offer help. Some will offer lies. You will listen and decide. You will keep moving east." Monster Slayer frowned. "Tell us about the monsters," he said. "We saw shapes in the night. Mother named some. She spoke of one that kills with his eyes." Spider-Woman's face tightened slightly. "Some monsters look like animals," she said. "Some look like people. Some look like rocks until they move. The one who kills with his eyes uses a stare that freezes the body. People fall where they stand. Their hands stay raised. Their faces lock in the last expression they wore. You will meet that monster later, if you live long enough. Your father's weapons will help you." Born for Water asked, "What about the giant?" And his voice remained calm, but his fingers tightened around the cords. "The one who eats people." Spider-Woman nodded. "Ye eat so," she said. "Big, loud, hungry. He kills for sport. He laughs when he breaks bones. He drinks water and leaves mud and blood behind. Your father will speak of him. You will face him." Monster Slayer's eyes brightened. He looked almost pleased. "Good," he said. "I prefer a monster that shows itself." Spider-Woman gave him a dry look. "Many young men prefer that," she said. "Many young men also bleed in the sand because they think preference changes danger." Monster Slayer accepted the reprimand with a brief grin. Spider-Woman rose again and walked to the entrance of the rock house. She pushed aside a hanging mat that covered the opening. A line of daylight cut into the dim chamber. She looked out, then stepped back. "The watchers still circle," she said. "The raven will speak to its master. The magpie will speak to its master. The vulture will speak to its master. That news moves fast. Your feet must move faster." Born for Water stood. Monster Slayer stood. They adjusted the items Spider-Woman had given them. Monster Slayer slung the feather hoop across his back using a strip of hide. Born for Water tied the pollen pouch securely. Monster Slayer bowed his head towards Spider-Woman. "We will remember your words," he said. Spider-Woman waved him off with a small flick of her fingers. "Remember them by using them," she replied. "Memory in the head does nothing when your feet stand on boiling sand." They walked toward the opening. Before they stepped out, Spider-Woman spoke again. "When you reach the first cliffs," she said, "do not rush. Watch the timing. Feel it. When the rocks slide apart, step forward. When they begin to grind together, step back. Then use the hoop and the pollen and sing the words I taught you. Keep your eyes open. Keep your hands steady. Born for Water nodded. Monster Slayer nodded. They stepped outside into bright daylight. The air felt colder after the warmth of the rock house. The sky looked clean and hard. The blackbird still circled far above, smaller now, as if it were already leaving. The twins began walking down the mountain, then east across the land. The slope tested their balance. Loose stones rolled underfoot. They moved carefully and kept their bodies low at steeper parts. When they reached flatter ground, they increased their speed. They covered miles before the sun reached its highest point. The land ahead opened into a long valley. At the far end, two cliffs stood facing each other, with a narrow gap between them. From where the twins stood, the gap looked like a thin line. Monster Slayer stopped and stared. "That is the first place," he said. Born for Water watched the cliffs for a long moment. "They move," he said. Even at that distance, they could see it. The cliffs slid inward, slow at first, then faster. The gap vanished. Then the cliffs slid apart again, leaving the passage open for a brief span. Monster Slayer exhaled. "Someone built a trap into the mountain," he said. Born for Water answered. "The mountain already had enough stone. The trap only needed motion." They moved closer. Each step brought the cliffs into sharper detail. The rock faces were scarred. Long grooves ran down them, marks left by stones grinding together over time. At the base of the cliffs lay broken rubble. Some stones looked freshly cracked. Some looked old and worn. As they approached, Monster Slayer spotted a line of bones near the entrance. A deer skull lay half buried in gravel. Farther in, smaller bones lay scattered, bleached, pale. Monster Slayer crouched and picked up one long bone. It fit in his hand. He turned it slowly, then dropped it back where he found it. Born for Water said, "People tried to pass." Monster Slayer nodded. "People failed." They stood close enough now to feel the air shift when the cliffs moved. When the rocks slid together, the wind pushed outward through the gap with a hard gust. Dust puffed out and drifted around their ankles. When the cliffs slid apart, the air sucked inward again, pulling loose grit toward the darkness between the stones. Monster Slayer watched the pattern. He counted in his head. He saw how long the gap stayed open. He saw how quickly it closed. Born for Water knelt and placed his hand on the ground. He felt the vibration through the stone. He looked up at his brother. "It closes faster than it opens," he said. Monster Slayer reached back and took the hoop from his back. He held it with both hands. The feathers fluttered slightly in the shifting air. Born for Water untied the pollen pouch. He dabbed pollen onto his fingertips, then onto his forehead. Monster Slayer did the same, pressing the pollen onto his skin. They stood facing the gap. The cliffs opened. Dust drew inward. The passage waited. Monster Slayer said, "Now." They stepped forward together and began to sing the words Spider-Woman taught them. Their voices filled the narrow space in front of the cliffs. The song stayed steady, with a rhythm built for walking. They kept their eyes open and their feet moving. Monster Slayer held the hoop stretched out in front of them, like a frame through which they walked. The cliffs began to slide inward. The sound grew louder, stone on stone, a deep grinding. The gap narrowed, dust blew into their faces. Monster Slayer kept walking. Born for Water kept singing. Their voices did not shake. The valley beyond the crushing cliffs widened and leveled out, and the twins felt the change in their legs at once, because the ground stopped fighting them for a while and let them move with long, easy steps. A thin stream ran along the left side of the path, shallow enough to see stones at the bottom, and the air carried the smell of wet soil and crushed grass, which felt almost generous after the dry rock and the grinding dust at the cliffs. But the generosity ended as soon as they reached the first stand of reeds, because this was not a pleasant thicket beside a pond where birds hid and children played. This was a wall of tall green stalks, packed so tightly that even light had trouble slipping through, and the tops swayed in a steady motion that did not match the breeze. Monster Slayer and Born for Water stopped at the edge, close enough to see that the reed stems were thick as wrists and marked with scars, and close enough to hear the sound of movement inside, a repeated snap and whip like someone striking bundles of sticks against each other. And they saw why the bones lay here too, because near the edge of the reeds, a deer carcass hung caught across two stalks, skinned open as if dragged through knives, and a line of broken arrows lay on the ground, their shafts shredded, their fletching torn away. Monster Slayer lifted the feather hoop from his shoulder and held it in both hands, the feathers brushing his forearms, and Born for Water opened the pollen pouch and dabbed it on his fingertips, then pressed it to his forehead and tongue, and Monster Slayer followed the same motions with the short patience of a man who had learned that precise steps keep you alive. They stood side by side at the entrance and watched the reeds for timing, because the stalks moved in patterns like a gate, swinging inward and outward in narrow lanes, and for a moment a thin corridor opened straight ahead. Monster Slayer said, "Now," and they stepped in, and the reeds reacted immediately, stems snapping toward them with enough force to bruise and cut. But the twins held the hoop out in front, as Spider-Woman had taught, and they began to sing the words with steady volume, their mouths shaping each line clearly, their feet landing carefully in the soft mud, and as they walked the reeds swished close, then slid away, and the corridor stayed open long enough for them to pass. A stalk swung down and struck Monster Slayer's shoulder hard enough to make him grunt, and he kept moving without breaking rhythm. And Born for Water took the hit of another stalk across his back and did not stumble. And they learned quickly that the reeds could still land blows even when the song guided their passage, so they held their bodies low and kept their arms tight, and after what felt like a long mile of green walls and whipping stems, they stepped out into open air again with mud on their calves and thin red lines on their skin, and they did not pause for relief, because they saw the next hazard ahead, a field of cane cactus spread across a shallow plain like a trap laid on purpose, each plant standing stiff and crowded, each spine long and pale, sharp enough to catch sunlight, and among the cactus lay more bones, smaller and more scattered, some with bits of dried skin still attached, and Monster Slayer spat once and said, "These places are built to make people turn back." And Born for Water answered, "We keep moving east," and their voices stayed dry, because their mouths were already dry. They approached the cactus slowly, because rushing into spines only makes you bleed faster, and they tried to pick a path between the plants, but the spaces narrowed the deeper they looked, and the spines leaned inward as if the plants had grown toward each other, and in some places the cactus formed archways that would catch a person's shoulders and drag them down. And Monster Slayer crouched, picked up a small stone, and tossed it gently into the field. The stone landed, rolled, and then snagged against a spine, and the cactus nearest to it quivered, and several others quivered too, and the spines shifted position in a wave that spread outward, which told them the whole field responded as a single thing. Born for Water looked at Monster Slayer and held out the pollen pouch without a word, and Monster Slayer took it, dabbed pollen onto his hands, then returned it, and Born for Water did the same, and they lifted the hoop again and began to sing, and then they stepped forward, placing their feet exactly, because even a small mistake here would end in a leg full of needles, and the cactus reacted the moment they entered, spines vibrating, plants flexing, the narrow gaps closing. But the twins kept the hoop stretched in front of them and kept the song steady, and the path in front of the hoop remained barely wide enough for two bodies, and it moved as they moved, like a corridor carved through the spines. Monster Slayer focused on his feet, and Born for Water focused on the plants at shoulder level, and between them they caught the moments when a spine swung too close, and they shifted their hips or turned their shoulders just enough to avoid it. Once, a long needle scraped Born for Water's forearm and left a thin line of blood, and he kept singing without pausing to look at it. And once, a spine caught in Monster Slayer's hair and tugged, and he yanked free hard enough to leave a few strands behind, and he laughed under his breath, a short sound of irritation and amusement, because he preferred losing hair to losing an eye. The field felt endless while they were inside it, because every step demanded attention, and every breath tasted of dust and plant sap. And then, as suddenly as the cactus had begun, it ended, and they stepped out into a strip of open ground with their clothes snagged and their skin marked, and they stood there for a moment with the hoop lowered, their song finished, and both of them breathing hard. Monster Slayer looked back at the field and saw the corridor close behind them, spines shifting back into place, and he said, "That place stays hungry." And Born for Water wiped blood from his forearm with his thumb and said, "We feed it with footprints and leave it with nothing else." And then they walked on, because the last hazard waited ahead and it did not hide. Ahead of them, the sky looked brighter than it had any right to look, even in late afternoon. And above the bright line they could see a structure that did not belong on the ground, a house that hung high above the world, its walls shining with the color of turquoise and white shell, and its edges sharp enough to catch sunlight. And the twins stood there in plain sight and stared at it with the unblinking focus of people who had come too far to feel shy. The air grew cleaner as they walked, and the plants changed again, fewer cactus, more low grass, more small flowers near thin streams, and in the distance they saw a line of birds standing along a ridge, watching, and they did not shoot at them, because that time had passed. And now they needed more than arrows. They needed entry into a place guarded by beings who did not welcome every visitor. They walked until the sun lowered toward the west and the light slanted across the land, and then they reached the base of a steep incline of rock that rose toward the sky, and at the top of that incline stood a wide opening, like a gate carved into stone, and a narrow path led upward in a series of worn steps. Monster Slayer tested the first step with his foot and felt that it held solid, and then they climbed, and the air thinned and cooled, and the ground under them seemed less like earth and more like clean stone. And when they reached the top, they found themselves standing before a doorway that opened into bright space, and the edge of the doorway was lined with shell and turquoise, and the floor beyond it looked like polished stone that reflected the light from above. Monster Slayer adjusted the hoop on his shoulder, and Born for Water tightened the pollen pouch at his belt, and they stepped across the threshold without bowing, because they did not understand bowing to their father, and because they had already knelt in mud and sand and dust, and they preferred to stand now. Inside, the house felt vast. The ceiling rose high. The walls glowed with pale blue and green. The floor stayed smooth under their feet. In one corner, a fire burned in a wide hearth, and the fire looked bright and steady, and it warmed the room without smoke. Along the walls stood objects that looked like tools and ornaments. Bowls made of shell, sticks carved and polished, bundles of feathers, and a large pipe resting on a rack, its stem long and straight. A woman sat against the western wall with her hands folded and her posture stiff, her hair neatly arranged, her face calm in a way that looked practiced, and she watched the twins with eyes that held no welcome. And beside the hearth stood two young men who looked strong and sharp, their bodies upright, their faces serious, and each carried something at his belt that looked like a tool. And the twins recognized them as the kind of beings who would step forward first when trouble entered a house. Monster Slayer spoke plainly, because he had no interest in ceremonies that wasted time, and he said, "We are the sons of Changing Woman," and Born for Water said, "We came to meet our father." And the two young men exchanged a glance and did not answer with words, because they did not need to. And then one of them stepped forward and took a blanket from a peg, and the other took another blanket, and together they wrapped the twins quickly. First one, then another, pulling the cloth around their bodies so tightly that their arms pinned to their sides, and Monster Slayer struggled for a moment before deciding struggle would waste breath, and Born for Water stayed still and watched, and the young men lifted them easily and placed them on a high shelf along the wall, as if the twins were bundles of wood stored for later. Monster Slayer kept his eyes open and stared at the ceiling, and Born for Water kept his breathing steady, and they waited, because they understood this was a test, and tests often begin with indignity. A sound came from outside, the heavy, confident footfall of someone entering his own home. Light shifted across the floor, and the room grew brighter, and then the sun entered, and he looked like a man, and he also looked like the source of the light, because his skin shone, and his eyes held a sharp brightness that made it hard to stare directly, and he walked to the center of the room and looked around as if checking that each object sat in the right place. His gaze landed on the woman at the wall, then on the two young men by the hearth, and then his eyes lifted to the shelf where the bundled twins lay, and he narrowed his eyes and said, "Who brought these?" And the woman answered with a flat voice, "Two boys came claiming they are your sons." And the son's mouth tightened, and he stepped toward the shelf and pulled the blankets away with quick hands, and Monster Slayer and Born for Water dropped to the floor, landing on their feet, because they had practiced balance their whole lives even without knowing it, and they stood with their shoulders squared. And Monster Slayer said, "We walked here from our mother's home," and Born for Water said, "We crossed the places that kill people." And the sun looked them over and said, "Many people claim kinship when they want gifts." And Monster Slayer replied, "We want answers and tools." And Born for Water added, "We want to kill monsters." And the sun's face showed a hint of irritation at the directness, and he said, "Then you can survive a few questions first." He led them to the east wall of the house, where sharp points of white shell protruded in a tight pattern. He grabbed Monster Slayer by the arm with a grip like heated iron and threw him hard against the wall. Monster Slayer hit the shell points with his back and shoulders. The points pierced the cloth of his shirt and pricked his skin. He grunted once, pushed off, and landed on his feet again. The sun's eyes flicked to Born for Water, and he grabbed him and threw him against another wall lined with turquoise points. Born for Water hit the wall, felt the points press into his clothes, and pushed off, landing upright. Both twins kept their faces calm. Monster Slayer brushed a hand across his back and found small cuts. Born for Water flexed his shoulder, testing for injury. The sun watched them and said, "You stand." And Monster Slayer said, "We stand." And then the sun turned and walked toward a small sweat lodge structure set into a side chamber, built of stone and earth with a low doorway, and he said, "Come." Inside the sweat lodge, the heat already waited. Red stones sat in a pit. The sun lifted a gourd of water and poured it over the stones, and steam rose quickly, hot enough to sting skin. The twins entered and sat, because the sun gestured for them to sit, and the doorway closed, and the darkness inside held only the glow of the stones. The heat thickened and sweat formed at once along Monster Slayer's forehead and ran down his nose. and Born for Water breathed through his mouth and kept his chest moving steadily. And the sun's voice came from outside, asking, "Is it hot?" And Monster Slayer answered, "It is hot." And Born for Water answered, "It is hot." And the sun poured more water, and the steam surged, and the twins' skin flushed and their eyes watered, and they held steady, because pain without movement is still survivable, and because they had already walked across boiling sand. Time passed in a way that felt slower inside the lodge, measured by breaths and by the sound of water hitting stone, and the sun asked again, "Is it hot?" And Monster Slayer answered with a voice that sounded tighter, "It is hot." And Born for Water answered, "It is hot." And then the heat eased slightly when the sun stopped pouring, and the twins remained seated until the doorway opened and light flooded in, and the air outside felt cool even though it carried warmth. And the sun stood there and watched them emerge, with sweat shining on their faces and clothes clinging to their backs, and he said, "You still stand." And Monster Slayer said, "We still stand." And then the sun's gaze held them for a long moment, measuring, and he turned toward the large pipe near the hearth. He lifted the pipe and held it with care, as if it mattered, and he packed it with tobacco and herbs, and lit it with a small flame taken from his own fire, and he drew smoke into his mouth and lungs, then exhaled slowly, and he held the pipe out to Monster Slayer first, because Monster Slayer stood closest. Monster Slayer took it and drew in smoke, and the smoke burned his throat and made his eyes water, and he held it anyway, because coughing would give the sun satisfaction. And then he exhaled and handed it to Born for Water, and Born for Water drew smoke and felt the same burn and forced his breathing into steadiness, and then exhaled and returned the pipe. The sun watched their faces as they handled the smoke and the burn, and his posture softened a fraction, and he said, "You came far." And Monster Slayer said, "We came because monsters hunt our people." And Born for Water said, "We came because our mother gave birth to us with help from holy people, and we want the truth." And the sun looked at them for a long moment, then said, "Changing Woman carried you." And Monster Slayer said, "Yes." And the sun said, "I visited her." And Born for Water said, "Yes." And then the sun inhaled once, a slow breath, and said, "You are my sons." Monster Slayer did not smile. He kept his expression sharp, because he had learned that victory often arrives quietly. Born for Water nodded once, satisfied, as if a piece had clicked into place. The sun looked from one twin to the other and said, "Speak your request." And Monster Slayer stepped forward and said, "We want weapons." And Born for Water said, "We want the knowledge to use them." And the sun's eyes narrowed, because he already knew what that meant. And he said, "You want to fight the Navajo?" And Monster Slayer said, "Yes." And Born for Water said, "Yes." And the sun turned and walked to a rack along the wall and began to lift items one by one, practical items shaped for hands and bodies, and he placed them on the floor in front of the twins, shirts that looked like scales of flint, helmets that would protect their heads, bows that felt strong when Monster Slayer tested the bend, quivers of arrows with heads that gleamed, stone knives with edges sharp enough to shave hair from a wrist. The sun named the arrows as he laid them down, and his voice stayed matter-of-fact, because these were tools and tools demand clarity. And then he said, "One monster matters first." And Born for Water asked, "Which?" And the sun said, "Yeah, yeet so." And Monster Slayer's jaw tightened, because he had heard the name, and he had wanted it. And the sun added, "He drinks and eats and kills. He also carries my blood." And Monster Slayer lifted his head and said, "We will kill him." And the sun said, "I will strike first." And Born for Water watched the sun carefully. Because that sentence carried rules the twins did not yet know, and he said, "Then we follow." And the sun nodded. And in that moment the twins understood that their fight would begin with a giant who drew breath under the same sun they had just met. And they gathered the weapons and tied them onto their bodies, each strap tightened, each tool secured, because now the story moved from getting answers to making bodies fall. The twins did not linger in the sun's house, because lingering invites second thoughts, and second thoughts invite delays, and delays invite teeth. So they worked quickly and with careful hands, tightening straps, checking knots, testing the bend of each bow, running thumbs along the edges of the stone knives, lifting the flint scale shirts and settling them onto their shoulders until the weight sat correctly across their backs. Monster Slayer moved with the restless focus of a man who had been handed the exact tools he had asked for and now wanted immediate proof that the tools would do what they promised. And Born for Water moved with a quieter precision, pausing to make sure every cord lay flat and every buckle held, because he knew that a loose strap becomes a problem at the exact moment you cannot spare a hand to fix it. The sun watched them in silence for a time, then walked to a low shelf and lifted 2 small bundles wrapped in cloth. And when he unwrapped them, he revealed 2 sets of headgear, each shaped to fit snugly, each lined with hard, smooth pieces of shell and flint that would turn a glancing blow into a scratch instead of a broken skull. And he placed one in Monster Slayer's hands and one in Born for Water's, and his voice stayed steady when he spoke, because he talked about tools the way a skilled craftsman talks, with clarity and without drama, saying, "Wear these when you face the first one." He swings a club and he throws stones. He aims for your head, and Monster Slayer nodded, already fitting the helmet onto his hair. And Born for Water slid his helmet into place and tied it under his chin with a quick knot. The sun then stepped to the hearth and lifted a long, straight pipe from its rack, and he held it out once more, because he wanted to see the twins accept his household's customs as well as his weapons. And Monster Slayer took the pipe, drew smoke, swallowed the burn, and passed it, and Born for Water did the same. And the sun watched their faces, and their eyes, and the set of their shoulders. And then he lowered the pipe and said, "You arrived here with help from Spider-Woman." And Born for Water answered, "Yes." And Monster Slayer answered, "She gave us a hoop and pollen and words." And the sun's mouth tightened as if he had opinions about Spider-Woman's methods, but he did not argue, because Spider-Woman's methods produced results, and he said, "Those words brought you here. These weapons will carry you farther. Hold them with care." He walked to the doorway and stepped outside, and the light shifted again, brighter in a way that made the twins squint. And they followed him onto the smooth stone platform beyond the house, where the edge dropped away into open sky, and Monster Slayer stopped short for a moment, because his feet wanted ground, and Born for Water placed a hand lightly on his brother's shoulder, steadying him without comment. The sun raised his arm and pointed across the wide span of air, and the twins saw the path he indicated, a bright track like a narrow road laid through the sky, and it held no railing and no fence, and it curved downward toward the distant earth, and the sun said, "This is how I travel," and Monster Slayer muttered, "Convenient," with a dry edge, and the sun looked at him and said, "You can complain after you live," and Monster Slayer smiled, because he appreciated being spoken to like a person who could take it. And then the sun called out in a voice that carried, and from the bright distance came the sound of hooves and the sight of 2 shining horses pulling a great disc, and the horses landed on the platform with a jolt that made the stone tremble underfoot, and the twins felt the heat of their bodies even before they drew close. The sun climbed onto the disc and gestured for the twins to climb behind him, and Monster Slayer went first, gripping the edge and swinging up with quick strength, and Born for Water followed and settled his feet carefully, and the sun took the reins and the horses surged forward, and the platform dropped away, and the twins felt their stomachs shift as the disc moved along the bright path, and the wind rushed at their faces and tugged at their clothes, and the world below grew small and distant, ridges and valleys flattening into patterns of color, and Monster Slayer leaned forward slightly and narrowed his eyes, because he wanted to remember every shape of the land, and Born for Water held steady and watched the sun's hands, because he wanted to understand how a being like this controlled such speed. The ride carried them above mountains, above mesas, above patches of forest and open plain, and the sun did not slow, because slowing would waste his day, and his day was measured in a strict schedule that held the world together. As they moved, he spoke over his shoulder, giving instruction the way a father gives instruction when he finally accepts his role, saying, Yeitso drinks at a lake near a mountain with dark stone. He moves in the late day. He eats whenever he wants. He walks loud. You will hear him before you see him. You will shoot him with the lightning arrows first. Save the strongest for the moment he rises again. And Monster Slayer said, he rises again, because Monster Slayer had the irritating habit of asking the exact question that revealed the unpleasant part of the plan, and the sun answered, he takes wounds and keeps walking. He carries tough flesh and strong bones. He falls and rises. Many people die thinking the first fall means the end, and Born for Water asked, who else waits there? And the sun said, other ones circle the place. Some serve him, some fear him and follow anyway. Keep your eyes open. And Monster Slayer asked, will you strike first? And the sun's jaw tightened again and he said, yes, I will strike first. That rule holds, and Born for Water accepted it as a rule because he had grown up with rules that came from older mouths and did not require explanation. And Monster Slayer accepted it with a grunt, because he liked rules only when they led to clean results. At noon, the sun slowed. The disk leveled above a wide span of land, and the light sharpened, and the twins saw their homeland far to the west, and they saw the shape of the sacred mountains in the distance, and Monster Slayer felt a brief tightening in his throat when he realized how far they had traveled on their own feet before ever stepping into the sky. And Born for Water watched the lines of rivers and ridges and memorized them, because memory in the head meant finding the way back later. The sun pointed down and said, there. And Monster Slayer followed the line of his finger and saw the faint patch where their village sat, too small to make out details, yet present, and he pictured changing woman sitting by her doorway, and he pictured his grandparents inside, and he pictured the wind wall breaking apart and the monsters stepping back, and he pictured the village still standing, because that was the image he needed to carry forward. The sun then pulled the reins and the horses turned, and the disc angled downward, and the bright road slanted toward the earth, and the wind rose louder, and the ground rushed up, and then, in a moment that felt like a sudden drop through cold water, the disc reached a place where light struck a mountain peak, and a bolt of lightning shot downward from that point, and the sun said, hold on, and the twins grabbed the edge, and the bolt stretched into a solid bright line, and the twins slid down it, feet first, hands gripping, bodies trembling from the speed, and the air burned cold against their faces, and when they reached the end they landed hard on rocky ground and rolled once, then came up on their knees with bows in their hands, because they were the kind of people who landed ready. They stood at the base of a mountain with dark stone and rough slopes. Pine trees grew in scattered clusters. The air smelled of resin and sun-heated rock. A wide lake lay nearby, its surface flat, its edges lined with reeds and mud, and the water reflected the sky in a pale blue sheet. Monster Slayer walked to the shore and crouched, scooping a handful of water and letting it run through his fingers. The water felt cool. Born for Water stood behind him and scanned the slope above, because he had learned that danger likes height. A voice spoke from behind them, close enough that Monster Slayer turned sharply with his bow raised. A young man stood there, slim and calm, dressed in clean clothing, holding a small staff. His face looked ordinary at first glance, yet his eyes held a sharp focus. Beside him stood a young woman with hair tied back, her hands clasped in front of her, and she watched the twins with the expression of someone evaluating. The young man said, "We have waited for you." Monster Slayer kept the bow raised for a breath, then lowered it slightly. "Who are you?" he asked. The young woman answered, "We belong to this place. We watch the lake. We watch the path. We saw you fall from lightning." Her voice stayed calm and level. Born for Water asked, "Do you serve the giant?" The young man shook his head. "We live where he drinks," he said. "We warn people who wander too close. Few listen." Monster Slayer glanced at the bones near the water's edge and believed him. "Then warn us," he said. The young man lifted his staff and pointed to a set of deep footprints pressed into the mud, each print large enough to hold a child. "He comes at the end of the day," he said. "He drinks until the water runs from his mouth. He looks around before he leaves. He hears well. He smells well. He grows angry fast." Born for Water asked, "Where does he sleep?" The young woman pointed toward a rocky outcrop higher on the mountain. "He sleeps in a cave," she said. "He keeps trophies there. He keeps bones there. He keeps things he stole from people. He laughs when he looks at them." Monster Slayer's mouth tightened. "Good," he said. "Then we meet him here, on open ground." The young man nodded once. "Wait on the ridge," he said. "Keep your bodies low. Keep the wind at your back if you can. When he comes, he will speak. He always speaks. He likes the sound of his own voice." Monster Slayer grinned. "I like the sound of my arrow," he said. Born for Water ignored that and asked, "Will you help?" The young woman looked at the young man, then back at the twins. "We will watch," she said. "We will tell you if others approach. We will run if we must. We do not carry your weapons." Monster Slayer accepted that. Born for Water accepted it too. Help came in many forms, and warning mattered. They climbed to a low ridge overlooking the lake. The ridge held scattered boulders and scrub. The twins crouched behind a rock and waited. Monster Slayer tested his bowstring, running his fingers along it and pulling once, then relaxing it. Born for Water opened the quiver and looked at the arrows. The heads gleamed with a hard light. He selected two and laid them beside him, ready. Monster Slayer chose his own arrows with less ceremony and laid them in the dirt, their shafts straight, their fletching clean. Time passed. The sun moved west, shadows stretched. The air cooled slightly. A breeze moved across the lake and created small ripples. A bird skimmed the surface and rose again. Monster Slayer leaned close to Born for Water and spoke quietly. "Do you feel different?" he asked. Born for Water did not look away from the lake. "We carry weapons now," he said. "We carry a father's words. That feels different." Monster Slayer said, "I mean inside. In the ribs. In the skin." Born for Water considered. I feel steady, he said. I feel like my hands belong to me more than they did before. Monster Slayer nodded slowly. Yes, he said. I feel like my bones fit together better. I feel like a door closed behind us when we left the sun's house. Born for Water glanced at him briefly. You describe it like a door, he said, and his tone held a trace of amusement. Monster Slayer shrugged once. People like doors, he said. They help you understand where you are. The young woman below the ridge lifted her hand. She pointed toward the slope. Her posture tightened. The young man beside her moved back a step, eyes wide. The twins heard it then, a heavy thump, then another, and another, each step pushing a small tremor through the ground. Loose stones shifted, dust slid down a rock face. A low grunt echoed between the trees. Monster Slayer lifted his bow. Born for Water picked up an arrow and set it against the string. They both breathed slowly. Yeitso emerged from behind a stand of trees. He was taller than a man by several heads, thick through the shoulders, heavy through the chest and belly, and his arms hung long, ending in hands that looked capable of lifting boulders. His skin looked rough and dark, patched with scars. A club rested on his shoulder. He walked toward the lake with the casual confidence of someone who expected no resistance in his territory. He reached the water and knelt, and the ground groaned under his weight. He scooped water into his mouth with both hands and drank loudly. Water spilled down his chin and onto his chest. He drank again and again, then slapped the surface of the lake with one hand as if to amuse himself. Then he paused. He turned his head slightly, sniffing. His eyes narrowed. He stood up and looked around. Monster Slayer felt his heart beat hard once. Born for Water tightened his grip on the arrow. Yeitso spoke in a booming voice that carried across the lake. "Who stands near my water?" he shouted. "Who smells like corn and smoke? Who smells like young blood?" Yeitso's charge ate up the distance fast, faster than his size should allow, and the ground shook with each step as if a herd of bulls had been shoved into one body, and his club rose high over his head, both hands gripping it as he ran. And Monster Slayer saw the arc of that weapon and measured it instantly, because a club like that only needed one clean hit to turn a skull into wet clay. He did not freeze, because freezing belongs to people who expect mercy, so he dropped into motion, stepping sideways and back, keeping his feet light on the uneven ridge, while Born for Water stayed square for a heartbeat longer to draw and loose his second arrow, the one with the broader crack of lightning in it, and the arrow struck the giant's shoulder with a flash that made the skin hiss and the muscle twitch. Yet it did not stop him. It only made him angrier. Yeitso roared, swung the club down in a straight, brutal line, and the club slammed into the ground where Monster Slayer had been, breaking stone and throwing up a burst of dirt that peppered Monster Slayer's face and teeth, and Monster Slayer spat grit and laughed once through clenched jaw, because he had learned that laughter keeps panic from taking root, and because he had no time for panic anyway. Born for Water moved then, running laterally to widen the angle, forcing the giant to turn his shoulders if he wanted to hit both of them at once. And the giant did turn, because he wanted that. He wanted the two small bodies crushed together under his club. He wanted an easy story to tell himself afterward. But turning cost him a fraction of speed, and that fraction mattered, because Monster Slayer drew his bow again and loosed another arrow into the giant's ribs, and the arrow hit with a bright snap and a sting of smoke, and Yeitso jerked, stumbled, then kept coming, teeth bared, eyes wide, breathing loud enough that the twins could hear the wet rasp in his throat. The giant's feet pounded the ridge, and loose stones rolled, and Born for Water leaped down behind a boulder, using it as cover for a moment, while Monster Slayer ran uphill, because climbing steals momentum from a charging body, and he wanted the giant's swing to land short, and Yeitso followed, hauling his bulk up the slope with a furious pace, club dragging for a step, then lifting again, and when he swung, the club clipped the edge of a rock and shattered it, and sharp fragments flew out and cut Monster Slayer's cheek, leaving a warm line of blood that he wiped away with the back of his hand without slowing. The sun hung low enough now that the light slanted across the lake and the mountain, and the giant's shadow stretched long over the stones, and the twins stayed outside that shadow whenever they could, because they understood the simple geometry of death, and they used that understanding like a third weapon. Born for Water rose from behind the boulder and ran to Monster Slayer's side, and they moved together now, drawing in unison, loosing in unison, their arrows striking in staggered rhythm, because they had practiced running side by side since childhood, and their bodies remembered that coordination. And the giant began to show it in the way his steps grew heavier, in the way his breath started to hitch, in the way his club rose a fraction slower each time. Still, he kept coming, and when he got close enough, he threw the club instead of swinging it, because desperation makes a brute inventive, and the club spun end over end through the air toward the twins, and Monster Slayer shouted, and both brothers dropped flat, pressing their bodies to the ground, and the club tore past them with a rush of wind and crashed into a tree behind them, splitting the trunk and scattering needles. The giant lunged forward with empty hands, fingers spread wide, aiming to grab and crush, and Born for Water rolled to the side, came up on one knee, and drove a stone knife into the back of the giant's hand when it slammed down, and the blade sank into thick flesh, and the giant screamed, snatched his hand back, and the knife came with it for a moment, before Born for Water yanked it free, and blood ran down the giant's wrist in a dark sheet, and that blood made the ground slick where it fell, and Monster Slayer saw it and used it, leading the giant onto the slick patch, because feet slip on blood, and a slip from a body that big ends in a fall. Yeitso charged again, and his foot landed in the wet, and his leg slid, and his balance shifted, and for the first time the giant looked surprised, his mouth open, his eyes blinking, and Monster Slayer drew the strongest arrow he had, the one whose head gleamed like a thin piece of captured daylight, and he loosed it straight into the giant's chest, and the arrow struck with a crack that echoed off the mountain, and Yeitso's body jolted hard, his arms flung outward, and he fell forward onto his knees, then onto his chest, and his forehead hit the ground with a dull, heavy thud that made the twins feel the vibration in their feet. For a moment, everything held still, because bodies do that when a very large body hits the ground, and the twins did not rush in like excited children, because Spider-Woman's voice lived in their heads, and the sun's instruction lived there too, and both of those voices had taught them the same thing in different ways, which was that the first fall often lies. Monster Slayer kept his bow raised and nocked another arrow, and Born for Water held his knife ready and watched the giant's shoulders, because a shoulder rises before a fist does, and the giant's breath came in a long, wet sigh, and dust drifted around his face, and his fingers twitched once, and Monster Slayer said, "He will rise." And Born for Water answered, "We end it before he rises," and they moved closer together, stepping carefully around the club that lay half buried in rubble, and they approached the giant's head from the side, because standing directly in front of a mouthful of teeth counts as optimism, and optimism is a luxury that gets eaten. Yeitso opened his eyes. He pushed his palms into the ground. He began to lift his chest. He did not wait for the lift to finish. He drew, aimed at the place where neck met shoulder, and loosed the arrow. The arrow struck and snapped through flesh. The giant's head jerked, and he made a choking sound. Born for Water stepped in at once and drove his stone knife into the same spot, with both hands on the handle, twisting hard. The blade bit deeper. Monster Slayer grabbed the other knife and struck again, sawing through thick sinew with short, hard motions, because there was no elegance available here, only effort and persistence, and the giant's arms flailed once, then slowed, and the choking sound faded into a wet gurgle, and then the body stopped moving, chest pressed to earth, fingers spread, face turned sideways in the dust. Born for Water stepped back and wiped his knife on a tuft of grass. Monster Slayer stood over the giant and breathed, sweat dripping from his jaw. He looked down at the body and said, "He smells worse up close." His voice carried a grim satisfaction, the kind that comes when a promise is kept with hard work. The young man and young woman who had waited near the lake stood at a distance, their eyes wide, their posture rigid. They did not cheer, they did not rush forward. They looked like people who had just seen a mountain move and stop. Born for Water called to them, "Stay back," and his tone carried authority, because authority grows quickly in a person who has just killed a monster that everyone feared. The young woman nodded quickly. The young man swallowed and nodded too. Monster Slayer knelt by the giant's head and gripped the thick hair near the scalp. He tested the weight. He grunted. "Help," he said to his brother, and Born for Water stepped in, and together they worked their knives again, cutting the last stubborn strips of flesh and tendon, and when the head finally separated, it dropped into Monster Slayer's hands with a heavy damp shift, and Monster Slayer almost lost his grip, because it was larger than any deer he had ever carried, and because blood made everything slippery. He adjusted his hold and lifted it, muscles straining, and Born for Water steadied the jaw for a moment to keep it from swinging and knocking Monster Slayer in the face, because being concussed by a dead giant would be a ridiculous end, and they both knew it. They dragged the head toward a flat patch of ground near the water. The young woman stepped closer, then stopped again when Born for Water lifted his hand. Monster Slayer set the head down with a heavy thud and sat back on his heels, breathing. He looked at the teeth. He looked at the thick tongue. He looked at the eyes that stared without focus. He felt a quiet satisfaction settle into his chest, not as a feeling of victory that needed singing, but as a simple fact that the body on the ground proved. Born for Water turned his head slightly, scanning the slopes, because the world rarely allows a single clean act without adding complications. He saw movement in the distance, shadows between trees, shapes too far to name. "They come," he said. Monster Slayer stood at once, wiping his hands on his clothes. "More," he said, and he smiled like someone invited to a familiar task. The first to appear was a horned creature, thick neck, broad shoulders, horns curving forward, hooves striking sparks from stone. It ran down the slope in a straight line, head lowered, because it understood one thing and one thing only, which was impact. Behind it, shapes moved with it, smaller monsters, and in the sky above, a dark winged shape circled lower. A bird with wings wide enough to cast a shadow like a roof. Born for Water grabbed his bow and nocked an arrow without hesitation. Monster Slayer did the same. They stood in front of the giant's head, because the head was proof and also bait, and if the monsters wanted to reclaim their fallen champion, they would come here. The horned creature charged. The ground shook again, though less than before, and dust rose around its hooves. It snorted and bellowed, and a string of saliva swung from its mouth. Monster Slayer waited until it reached the distance where an arrow would hit solid, then released. The arrow struck the creature's shoulder and flashed. The creature stumbled, but did not fall. Born for Water released his arrow a beat later and hit the same place. The horned creature shrieked, turned slightly, then kept charging, because pain does not always teach caution. Monster Slayer ran sideways to widen the angle. Born for Water stayed in place for a fraction longer, then moved back, because the horns came close enough to gore the air. The horned monster crashed through the space where they had stood, struck a boulder, and its horns splintered on the rock. It reeled, stunned. Monster Slayer stepped in and drove a stone knife into the side of its neck. Born for Water struck the other side. They worked quickly. The creature convulsed, then collapsed, hooves scraping the ground until they stopped. The winged monster dropped lower then, aiming for the giant's head, because carrying it away would deny the twins the trophy and perhaps feed the monster's hunger. Its talons stretched. Its beak opened. Monster Slayer drew and loosed an arrow into its chest as it descended. The arrow hit, and the bird screamed. It flapped hard, trying to climb. Born for Water loosed another arrow that struck a wing joint. The wing bent wrong, and the bird spun, crashed into the lake with a tremendous splash, and water surged out in waves that slapped the shore. The young man and young woman backed away fast, faces pale. The bird thrashed in the water, wings beating, sending droplets everywhere. It tried to rise. Monster Slayer ran to the water's edge and shot another arrow into its back. The bird's thrashing slowed. It floated for a moment, then sank, leaving ripples and a few feathers on the surface. More shapes approached from the trees, but they slowed when they saw the bodies on the ground. Some turned their heads as if considering retreat. Born for Water raised his bow and held it steady, arrow ready. Monster Slayer stood with his knife in one hand, bow in the other, breathing hard. A tall figure stepped forward from the shadows, a creature with long arms and a face shaped like a twisted mask, eyes set deep and glowing faintly. It raised one hand, palm outward, and stared at the twins with fierce focus. Born for Water's body stiffened. His knees locked. His grip on the bow tightened. He felt his muscles resist his own command. Monster Slayer felt it too, a sudden slow tightening in the joints, a reluctance to move, like his body had forgotten the next step. "The one who kills with his eyes," Monster Slayer said, his voice forced through clenched teeth. The creature smiled, slow and ugly, and kept staring. It stepped forward, confident, because confidence grows in a monster that has watched people freeze and fall. Its hand remained lifted, its gaze fixed. Born for Water forced his fingers to move. It took effort. It felt like pushing through thick mud. He turned his head slightly, breaking the direct line of sight, because Spider-Woman had warned them, and warning carried instructions, and he shouted without looking straight at the monster, "Aim where it stands. Do not meet its eyes." Monster Slayer turned his face away too, keeping the creature in the edge of his vision. He drew his bow by feel more than sight, focusing on the shape of its body and the sound of its steps. He released the arrow. The arrow struck the creature's chest with a flash. The creature hissed, surprised, and its stare wavered for a breath. That was enough. Born for Water used that moment and drew, loosed, and his arrow struck the monster's shoulder. The monster staggered back, hand lowering. The stiffness in the twins' bodies eased at once. Monster Slayer advanced, knife ready. The monster raised its hand again, trying to lock their bodies once more. But Born for Water moved first this time, stepping to the side, drawing the monster's attention away from his brother. and Monster Slayer used the opening to close the distance and drive the knife into the monster's ribs. The monster screamed and flailed. Born for Water loosed another arrow at close range into its throat. The monster fell hard and lay still, eyes open, staring at the sky without focus. The remaining monsters hesitated. They had expected to see two boys die. They had expected easy meat. They saw instead a dead giant, a dead horned monster, a dead eye killer, and feathers drifting on the lake. They made small, angry noises. One threw a stone. The stone landed short. Another creature hissed and backed away. Then they began to retreat, stepping backward into the trees, still watching, still snarling, but giving ground. Monster Slayer called out after them, "Tell the others. Tell them the twins carry knives." Born for Water added, "Tell them the road changes today." The monsters vanished into the shadows. The lake shore fell quiet again, aside from the sound of water settling and the twins breathing. The young man and young woman stood at a distance, hands over their mouths, eyes wide. Monster Slayer walked back to the giant's head and kicked it lightly, as if checking that it stayed dead. Then he looked at his brother. "We should take this," he said. Born for Water nodded. "We take it to show the people. We take it so the monsters remember." They lifted the head together again, adjusting their grips, and began to carry it away from the lake, step by step, muscles burning. The sun lowered toward the horizon. Their shadows stretched long across the ground. Behind them, the bodies remained. The lake reflected the fading light. The mountains stood still. They walked toward home, carrying proof in their arms. The twins walked through the late afternoon with the giant's head hanging between them, their arms locked under its thick jaw and matted hair, their shoulders aching with every step, and the smell of blood and old meat clinging to their clothes. And neither of them complained, because complaining wastes breath, and breath belonged to walking, and the land around them opened into wide, low hills and scattered trees, and they moved along the same paths that had once carried them away from home. Only now the ground felt different under their feet, firmer, as if the earth itself had learned their weight. And Monster Slayer glanced ahead often, because he expected to see the first signs of people, smoke from cooking fires, tracks in the dust, something that said the world still held those who had waited for them. And Born for Water kept his eyes on the ground and the horizon at the same time, because he had learned that danger and home both announced themselves quietly. By the time the sky turned the color of old copper, they reached the first outlying fields of their village, and the people saw them at once, because two young men carrying a giant's head draws attention, and a cry rose from the nearest house, and then another, and then many voices joined, and people poured out into the open, men and women and children, some holding tools, some holding nothing, all staring with wide eyes as the twins approached. And Monster Slayer lifted his chin and kept walking, because this was the moment that mattered, and Born for Water walked at his side with the same steady pace, and when they reached the center of the village, they lowered the head to the ground together, setting it upright so that its dead eyes faced the people, and a hush fell over the crowd, because fear looks different when it lies on the ground instead of towering overhead. Changing Woman stepped forward from the crowd. Her hair hung loose over her shoulders. Her eyes moved over her sons, and the blood on their hands, and the scars on their skin. She walked close enough to touch them. She placed one hand on Monster Slayer's cheek, and one on Born for Water's shoulder. "You came back," she said. Monster Slayer nodded. "We brought proof," he said. Born for Water said, "The giant will drink no more." The people pressed closer. A child reached out and touched the giant's matted hair, then pulled his hand back quickly. An old man bent low and stared into the dead eyes. A woman crossed herself with shaking fingers. The fear that had lived in their chests for years began to loosen, not all at once, but enough to change how they breathed. That night, fires burned across the village. People cooked what food they had. They passed bowls from hand to hand. They spoke in low, excited voices. They asked the twins to speak, and Monster Slayer told them how the giant fell, how the arrows struck, how the knives cut, and he did it with plain words and no extra flourish, because the truth needed no decoration, and Born for Water added the parts about the monsters who had come and run, and he named them, and people nodded as if hearing those names already felt safer. Later, when the fires burned low and the children slept, Changing Woman sat with her sons outside her home. The giant's head rested at the edge of the village, watched by men with spears. The stars filled the sky. The air cooled. Changing Woman looked at her sons for a long time before she spoke. "You found him," she said. Born for Water nodded. "We stood in his house. We took his weapons." Monster Slayer said, "He struck first." Changing Woman closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "You walk a path that moves forward," she said. "That path will carry you through many places. People will call you when monsters appear." Monster Slayer smiled faintly. "We will answer." Born for Water said, "We keep moving." Changing Woman reached out and took their hands. "Then walk carefully," she said, "and come back when you can." The firelight flickered across their faces. The village breathed in its sleep. Beyond the circle of houses, the dark hills waited, full of roads that led to trouble and to work.